It's a great pleasure to be back here in the Valley. I wrote a book in about 2000 at the height of the dot-com boom called Bobos in Paradise, which was more or less set at the Restoration Hardware in Palo Alto. I actually saw a woman get arrested there protesting social injustice, first sign of the Trump movement. But I sort of got a little into the Silicon Valley culture. I used to drive by the elementary schools that would let out at 3 in the afternoon. You'd see these third graders with these 80-pound backpacks. And if the wind blew them over, they'd sort of be beetles stuck there on the ground. And then I would notice the cars that would come to pick them up. It was usually an Audi, a Saab, and a Volvo, because in those days in the Valley, it was socially acceptable to have a luxury car so long as it came from a country hostile to U.S. foreign policy. That was okay. And I became fascinated by the women who would come up and pick them up. They were highly successful career women who'd taken time off to make sure all their kids could get into Stanford. And I called them Uber moms, and you could usually tell the Uber moms because they weighed less than their own children. They had like little yoga things, mats stapled to their hips, and they were sort of, at the moment of conception, they were doing little butt exercises to stay fit and trim. During the moments of pregnancy, they were taking so many soy-based nutritional formulas, the babies were plopping out like these 16-pound giant, like toothless defensive linemen plopping out in the living room. The Uber moms were cutting the umbilical cord themselves and flashing little Mandarin flashcards at the little things to get them ready for Stanford. And so I got into the culture out here. I got into all the progressive grocery stores you eat at, the Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, where all the cashiers look like they're on loan from Amnesty International. My favorite section of the trade food, I remember in those days, I loved the snack food sections of the Whole Foods, because it couldn't have pretzels or potato chips. That wouldn't be morally enlightened enough. And so they had all these seaweed-based snacks, which I developed a liking for something called veggie booty with kale, which is for kids who come home and say, Mom, I want a snack that'll help prevent colorectal cancer. And so they would give them that, and then I'd go down 101 and go to the big box malls, or the Walmart and the Petco and all the suburban theme restaurants along the highway there, which if they merged would be called Chili's, Olive Garden, Hard Rock, Outback Cantina, and then the Walmart, and then my favorite was the Costco, the Price Club, which is like Walmart on acid. And so I remember driving around looking at these people buying like 90-pound bags of detergent, 150-pound bags of tater tots, 14,000 Q-tips in a single package. It's 28,000 swabs because there's one at either end. And I remember thinking, the Valley, people are so optimistic. Who comes here shopping for condoms? Because the quantities are so gigantic. So I really came to believe in the optimism they have here in Silicon Valley. And my interests have moved on, but I come back here a lot. I wrote a book on character about 2 years ago called Road to Character, and my interest shifted a little more in the moral direction. I learned if you write a book on character, it doesn't really give you good character. And if you read a book on character, frankly, it doesn't give you good character. But if you buy a book on character, it gives you excellent character, so I recommend that. I did a fellowship out here at Stanford back in 1984. Before that, the admissions officers at Columbia, Brown and Wesleyan, decided I should go to the University of Chicago, which is a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. That's my favorite saying. I majored there in philosophy and celibacy, and didn't lead the most moral life, or even the most broad-thinking life. I went to New York, and if you hung around the Upper East Side back, especially in the 80s, the Tom Wolfe, what we used to think of as the Donald Trump era, I would hang around these ladies who lunch on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, these tall, thin ladies who didn't actually have calves. They didn't have thighs, they just had one calf on top of the other. And they were usually married to hedge fund guys who had made their billion, and they were now like 85 years old, and they decided to not die. And so they hired these squads of personal trainers, and they were wrapped head to toe in spandex. They're popping Cialis like breath mints. And if you went running around Central Park in those days, they'd zoom right by you like 20 miles an hour. Shrunk down, they were like 4'11", 80 pounds, and it was like being passed by a little iron raisinette as you went by there. And so those are the kind of lives a lot of us lead, busy with work. busy with home. But there come moments in life where you begin to think a little broadly, a little more deeply, and a little more weirdly about the culture and the history. And I had one of those moments. I do a show, which I'm about to race off to right after here, called The News Hour on PBS. We do a segment called Shields and Brooks with Mark Shields. We wanted to call it Brooke Shields. That would have been better. But it was about like 10 years ago, and we did it was summertime. And I drove home to my home then in Bethesda, Maryland, and I pulled into the driveway of my house, and it was like 7:30 on a summer afternoon, so it was still light out. And I pull into the backyard, and I look into the backyard, and my 3 kids, who were then 12, 9, and 4, playing in the backyard with one of these little supermarket balls. And they're kicking the ball up in the air, and they're racing across the yard to try to get it, and they're laughing, and they're giggling, and they're tumbling all over each other. And I pull in, and I happen to see this tableau of perfect family happiness. And it's one of those moments, and all parents have had it, where time seems to stop, reality sort of spills outside its boundaries, and you're just confronted by a level of joy that you haven't earned. And when you get a moment like that, it sort of pierces through you a little, and you want to be worthy of such a moment. And so you want to think more broadly about your own inner life, but also about the state of the country, the state of the world, and the state that they're going to inhabit. I have others of those moments. I'll just mention one of them. Every Thursday night, I go to a dinner in Washington, D.C., and it's hosted by 2 friends of mine, a husband and wife couple named Kathy and David. And they've got a kid who was in one of the D.C. public schools who had a friend who his home was messed up, dad was gone, mom had some drug and health issues, and so he didn't have stuff to eat or a bed to sleep in. And so Kathy and David said, you can stay with us. And so the kids stayed with them periodically, and then he had a friend in the same situation, and he had a friend, and he had a friend. And now when you go to Kathy and David's basement, there's a bunch of mattresses on the floor, and at any given moment, 15 to 20 kids eating and staying in their home. And so I have dinner over there every Thursday, and some of the kids sing, some read poetry, and we sort of serve as their audience. But what they do for us is a complete intolerance of social distance. And so the first time I get there, I'm an emotionally reticent guy. I grew up in a culture where the phrase was, think Yiddish, act British. And so we're a little reticent. And so I meet a kid, and I go to shake his hand, and he says, we don't shake hands here. We hug here. And so we're just all over each other, and there's a lot of intimacy. I have a friend who came over, he does youth work, and he said, and we were talking, and he was sort of in the mix of this dinner, and he said, you know, I've been doing youth programs for 50 years, and people always ask me, what programs turn around lives? And he says, in all that time, I've never seen a program turn around a life. All I've seen is relationships turn around lives. And so I mentioned these 2 stories of me and the kids in the backyard and the dinners on Thursday night in D.C. because in the last half of 2015 and the first half of 2016, I wrote a whole series of columns on the following theme: don't worry, Donald Trump will never get the Republican nomination. And having gotten that wrong, I've spent the time since traveling around the country in Trump areas trying to figure out what's going on. And this has not been a depressing journey. Wherever you go, you get organizations like this one who are community builders and community healers. I was in Houston. There's a little Latino neighborhood in between 3 different freeways, and a young woman had come in and created an after-school program for like 1,400 kids. And she'd just come out of New England to do this. I was in Navajo Reservation in New Mexico, and a couple had come down from Minnesota to do drug treatment for 60-year-old ex-felons. Not glamorous work, and the day we visited them, they had $17 in their bank account. But when you travel around, especially to Trump areas, you notice this crisis of intimacy, a crisis of community, and a crisis of solidarity. And this is pervasive across our society. And I just want to start here because I want to remind us why Trump exists. The thing I learned from this year's travel is that the 21st century is not going to look like the 20th century. A lot of us grew up in this amazing half century from 1950 to 2000, which we had some problems, but it was an amazing century of prosperity and growth and peace. We are not going to have that again. So one of the things, when you go around this country, you see the collapse of social trust. A generation ago, most people said they trusted their neighbors. The majority of Americans said that. Now only 19% of millennials say they can trust the people around them. You see isolation. A generation ago, only 8% of Americans lived alone. Now it's 28%, and in urban areas, it's 40%. Decline in friendships. The number of people who say they have no close friends has doubled in a generation. Epic rise of loneliness. One study found that among Americans 45 or over, 35% are lonely. A decline in social connection, I think, in part caused by some technology. I'm not a technophobe by any means, but I'm beginning to think the ubiquity of smartphones has pushed us over a threshold. According to one study, the average person checks their phone 221 times a day, every 4.3 minutes. I'm guilty of that. A study done at Baylor University found the students there were on their phone 10 hours a day. So with each other, but also not with each other. The fastest growing religious group is non-affiliated. The fastest growing political party is non-affiliated. There's been an epic rise in suicide. So now 25% more Americans die of suicide than die of car crashes, and suicide is just a synonym for loneliness and a breakdown in social capital. And so that wreckage is happening out there in the country. You see people falling through the cracks. Wherever I went in the country, and especially in the Trump areas, opiate addiction was so ubiquitous. One study of just one 3-month period found that 11% of the adults in Ohio were on opiates. You get a sense of people feeling betrayed. You get a sense of a sort of a moral injury that they used to have people used to be able to say, hey, I'm not the richest guy in the world. I'm not the most famous guy in the world, but I can be counted on my neighbors to live up to my roles here and to fulfill my responsibilities, and I get a little dignity out of that. And for some reason, either because of the rise of celebrity TV or reality TV, people who are not super rich and super famous, a lot of them feel completely invisible. And all of these divisions and all of this distrust is exacerbated along class lines. It used to be high school educated families and college educated families looked basically the same. But now high school educated families have like 3 times the divorce rate, multiple times the single parenthood rate, multiple times the suicide rate, multiple times drug addiction, smoking, obesity. It's just a chasm now. The average college-educated parents invest, on average, $5,300 per child per year just on extracurricular activities. And as a result, the children of college-educated parents participate in high school sports twice as more likely as the children of high school-educated parents. It's just a bifurcation from age up. And so what you find is, and I think what Trump grows out of is first this amazing decline in the social fabric, a loss of intimacy. The second thing is an economic transition we went through without even noticing it. And for those of us who live in Washington or in New York or here, it's not as evident day to day as it is in a lot of places where people voted for that guy. Around 2000, something shifted in the economy. From 1948 to 2000, the average growth rate was 2.3% a year for the US GDP. From 2000 today, the average growth rate is less than 1%. Even taking out the 2008 financial crisis, we've grown at only 1.1% since then. That means that has led to a collapse in the workforce. Among primary age working age Americans, for each one person looking for work, 3 people have dropped out of the labor market. That's 10 million Americans have dropped out of the labor market who are now sitting on their couches. And that's true as women as well as men. Since the era of feminism, the number of women in the labor market has been rising until this 2000 tipping point, and now the female labor force participation rate is back to where it was in the 1980s. So you've got a lot of people who are just in society, but sort of out of society. There are 17 million American men in our society with a felony conviction on their resume. What do these people do? What do the 10 million who dropped out of the labor force do? They watch, on average, 2,000 hours of TV a year. Watching TV is their job. 50% of them are on opiates paid for by Medicaid. They're not leading lives they can be proud of. And they have slipped through the cracks. The odds that you will earn more than your parents in 1977 were 86%. 86% earned more than their parents. Now it's only 51%. And so the social fabric has divided, the economy has collapsed for a lot of these people. And what has happened, and what Donald Trump understood and what I did not understand, was that politics had shifted fundamentally. That it's no longer what we think of as the left-right divide between big government and small government. That was the debate I grew up with. George McGovern versus Barry Goldwater, or Ronald Reagan versus Walter Mondale. That was the debate. But that debate is over. The new debate is open-closed. On one side are those, most of us in this room, who feel the tailwinds of globalization and the meritocracy at our backs. All these forces are propelling us forward to opportunity and freedom and prosperity, and we tend to favor open trade, open borders, open multiculturalism, and open social mores. Then there were the people I met, especially in the last year, who feel the headwinds of globalization and meritocracy blasting in their faces, who favor controlled trade, controlled immigration, controlled culture, and traditional social mores. From 1776 to 2000, the general ethos of America was the kind you saw here, you see here, a dynamic ethos of faith in the future. There's a great book that was set, I think, in North Dakota called Giants of the Earth. It was written in the 19th century, and it showed a farmer taking a guest around his farm, and he said, this is the farmhouse, and these are the outbuildings, and these are the crops, and these are the cattle. And the visitor said, well, I don't really see anything here. And the farmer said, well, I haven't built them yet, but they exist in my mind. And that's a future-oriented mentality, to see the present from the vantage point of the future. And that pretty much has been how Americans have thought. People come, they would cross the frontier, they'd stop in Ohio, they'd think this is a good valley, but if we keep going, we'll find an even better valley across the next ridge. And they just kept going until they got here. But the rising political movements since then, and in this century, do not have that mentality. And it's been interesting. I've spent a lot of time recently with some French politicians and some others. For the first time, American politics looks exactly like their politics. The rising Trump movement, the rising Brexit movement, the National Front movement in France, the current governments in Hungary, Turkey, Poland, the Philippines, they are not forward-looking. They're fearing of the future, and they're trying to regain some security and control. And the people who voted for Donald Trump just want somebody to protect them. And they are very realistic about the guy. A lot of them think he's a schmuck, but they want that protection. And they're against disruption, they're against innovation, they're against risk, and they are not the culture that we have traditionally known in this country because they're driven by insecurity. And so that's why I think this political shift is not just Trump, it's all around the world, and it matters to all of us. It has been captured in the form of Steve Bannon, the Trump's chief ideologist. He certainly did his reading in European philosophers, and he has a new definition of America, which is very different than the definition that I just described of the forward-looking. He sees America almost the way Russians see Russia, that the heart of America is in the deep, profound America, the land of sort of the peasants, the workers, and that it's in the past, and there's tremendous nostalgia for the past, not hope for the future. And what's been interesting to me is as this administration has gone on in the short month of its existence, Steve Bannon's vision has consolidated its grip on the administration. It was a test to me to see, there were sort of two tests that I was curious about with the Trump administration. The first was how much of it is a Bannon administration and how much of it is a Paul Ryan type administration. That is to say, there's a conventional Republican way to do government. You cut taxes, you shrink regulations, you open free trade. And some of the appointees that Trump has picked are sort of in that classic Republican camp. But the Bannon administration and the Bannon ethos is very different. It's not based on creative destruction of capitalism. It's based on ethnic nationalism. It's based on the idea that we really need to keep our culture coherent. I was very struck by a Bannon comment about a year ago where he was not only objecting to illegal immigration, which one expected, but somebody made the point to him, well, a lot of immigrants do great things for our country. Look at all the CEOs in Silicon Valley who were born from abroad and came here and helped create great companies. And he said, well, that's a problem too, because it tears at our civic fabric. And so ethnic nationalism is very different than the free market republicanism we are used to. And so I've been wondering, well, is it going to be more Bannon or more regular Republican? And the answer is not clear. It's sort of a gestures in both directions. But I've been struck by how much Bannon's mental grip has really settled upon the administration. If you watched the Trump press conference yesterday, I assume you're still waking up from the hangover if you watch the Trump. It's like a drinking game, except you get drunk without actually drinking, just watching that guy. But everything he said and the desire to pick the media as the opponents, that's pure Bannon. And one of the things I've noticed just in the last few weeks is every other rival power center to Bannon within the White House has suddenly woken up with their knife in their back. So Michael Flynn, the former national security advisor, is gone. Reince Priebus, the chief of staff, has been attacked by a wave of 1,000 leaks and looks very much emasculated. Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, potential power rival, tried to pick a man named Elliot Abrams to be his deputy. Bannon vetoed the choice effectively, and Tillerson looks neutered. They were going to name this new guy, Howard, to be the National Security Council chief, but he too learned he wouldn't be able to even pick his own staff. And so the effective national security advisor is Steve Bannon. And so that means to me that Trump, and I think this is not a stupid play on their part, that Trump understands that some, or at least feels vestigially, that some success on his part is going to be involved in riding this global movement, this ethnic nationalist populist movement. And so they seem to be heading in that direction, and that does not strike me as good news for the Valley. You know, this area, more so 10, 20 years ago than today, had an aversion to politics in any form. And let's just keep our head down, let's do our business, and politics will go away. My 2 points to that are not caring about politics is a luxury that only those who live in well-governed societies can indulge in. That if you live in a poorly governed society where law of order breaks down, the court system is breaking down, and you can't trust that the contracts will be enforced, you do not have the luxury of not believing in politics. And the second is related, that if you can ignore politics, but politics probably is not going to ignore you. And if the president decides that any time a company opens a manufacturing plant abroad, he's going to come down on that company, well, then everybody has to worry about that. And so that shift, I think, is real. The second thing that's interested me in the Trump administration is how are they going to implement any of this stuff? We have a Constitution, and that Constitution is built on a principle. And the principle is we are not a monarchy. We don't have single individual rule here. We have checks and balances. What effectively that means is we have group rule, the establishment rules here. And Donald Trump declared war on the establishment, and shock of all shocks, the establishment has declared war on him. And so how is he going to get anything done? And so what we've seen over the last few weeks is the establishment taking it out on him. The intelligence community, I've seen them destroy one president after another. It's been an oddity being a reporter in Washington. You would think that the agencies that would leak the most would be those not trained in security, like the National Forestry Service or something like that. But they don't leak at all. The two agencies that leak the most are the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agencies, because their whole job is to take information and weaponize it to destroy people. And that's what they do. And they did it very effectively to George W. Bush when it served them, and they're going to do it very effectively to Donald Trump. It really struck me in one of our the Times stories, and I didn't write them, so I'm not directly involved. It struck me that very quickly, within a day, they had 9 anonymous sources. To get 9 sources to really risk their careers to leak some information is very unusual. That means there's a lot of people willing to unearth things. So the intelligence community has declared war on Trump. The civil service has a great capacity to not do anything. I once asked President George W. Bush, toward the end of his term, I said, what's the one thing you've learned in government that you didn't know beforehand? And he said, there's a lot more passive-aggressive behavior in government than I understood, which means he would say something and nothing would happen. And so an order would come down from the president, and it lands on the desk of somebody, nothing happens. And that's already beginning to happen among the civil service. So in my column today, I compared Trump to like Captain Kirk on the Starship Enterprise. He's on the command deck with all these pretty buttons, and he can push all the buttons, but they're not attached to anything. And so I'm not sure much will get done. The media, I can tell you, those of us in the national media, we find him amusing, horrifying, we find him unhinged and insane, but we have also ways to make life difficult, especially if you have a president who's obsessed with the media as much as he loves it and hates it. The court system, he's attacked the judges and the courts in a way that's deeply offensive. Judges will have no compunction blocking his orders, even on the flimsiest legal grounds. And then there's the simple matter of competence. I mean, it's not like campaigning. There are 696 positions in any White House that require require Senate confirmation. 696. We're a month into the administration, and the Trump administration has not come up with names or nominees for 661 out of that 696. So I had a friend from a European country say, I want to bring over a delegation to meet with my counterparts in the Trump administration, but we had to cancel the trip because there's no one there. You go to the State Department, and Rex Tillerson's, he's probably mopping the floors and making the coffee because there's no one else. By the way, it was fascinating that the State Department had no participation in Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to the U.S. They had no participation in the Japanese delegation visit. To have these big foreign meetings without participation of the State and Defense Department is unheard of. And so you've got an insular group that doesn't necessarily know how to do things. By 100 days in the office, Bill Clinton had passed 24 laws, John F. Kennedy 26, Harry Truman 55, FDR 76. If we get 5 or 10, I'll be shocked. And so there's just a sense of not getting things done. And the more you hear about the inner workings of the White House, the more it sounds like sheer misery. And infighting, the presidential attention span is very short. People thinking, well, maybe I can do a briefing in the form of a cable TV news show and he'll watch that. And so it just sounds dysfunctional. The third thing to look for is we're about to enter a world of much less order. It's interesting when you go around the world and go, especially with U.S. government delegations around the world, there's an assumption, or has been, that the U.S. is sort of the leader. Other countries say, what do we do? What do we do? They defer the initiative to the U.S. But what's going around in national capitals all around the world is the belief they're all doing their psychoanalyses of who the new leader is. And I think they're coming away with 2 realizations from what I've heard. One, this is not like a normal administration, which is about an administration and rule of law. This is a monarchy. This is about personality and one thing. And 2, it's up to us to take the initiative. They're just not on top of the ball, so we have to be the aggressor here. And that if we give Donald Trump a lollipop, we'll be able to take his lunch. And so what you've seen is other countries rolling the administration. China on the one China policy, Bibi on the 1 or 2 state solution in the Middle East. The Europeans have more or less secured the Iran deal. And Russia had done this amazing turn in the last week, where Russia seems to have helped him get elected. I don't know if it was dispositive, but it was some help. But then the last week, the Russian state media has turned very hostile on Trump. They've got their planes buzzing our ships. One of the things we know about Vladimir Putin, he always pushes the envelope. He always takes that risk. He always wants to see how much he can grab. And so it looks like he's about to somehow be on the grab of something. And so I see an administration that is sort of cohering around an ethnic nationalist viewpoint, but not willing to be, not capable of being active. A colleague of mine, Fareed Zakaria, called it the rocking horse presidency. Like you're rocking furiously back and forth, but you're not actually going anywhere. And a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing, and then with a destabilized order, a destabilized world. And so that's something we all should care about. And my assumption is that the Trump, I look at it, what I take to be a sort of a chaotic administration, and I think, well, this can't last. It's just not sustainable. But then I think, well, how exactly does it stop lasting? Will there be impeachment? Will there be a resignation? It's very hard to see how that would exactly happen. The Republicans on Capitol Hill, we've all been doing careful listening to them. Are they beginning to get a little concerned? Well, personally, they're getting willing to be concerned. They're not even close to being disloyal to Donald Trump. In one of the polls today, Donald Trump among Republicans had 83% support, which is higher than the support Ronald Reagan had among Republicans in this point in his administration. So 65% of the country may look at Trump and think, geez, but 35% looks at him and looks at that press conference and say, exactly. And so he's can be a 35% president for a long time. And so I don't think he can be removed easily. I don't think he's going to function. He's just going to sit there and hold press conferences. And so the question I'm often asked is, how do you resist if you're the sort of person who's not a Trump fan? And I don't think that's the right question. I think the right question is, how do we replace? And so Donald Trump did not emerge from nothing. He is the wrong answer to the right question. He emerged from the social fabric decaying I described earlier. He emerged from the economic stagnation I described earlier. And those realities are still there. And so the key thing for all of us is to address those realities so he can be replaced with something. Because if it's not Trump, then it'll just be some other ethnic nationalist taking his stead, as Jean-Marie Le Pen gave way to Marine Le Pen in France, and so on and so on. So to me, those of us who are not fans of Trump, and I assume some people in this room are, the idea is, how do we revive the American idea so it is the Silicon Valley idea of disruption, of the future, of innovation, of embracing dynamism over stasis? How do we promote growth? How do we get back up to 2.3% growth? I actually haven't seen too many economists with good answers for that one. And finally, how do we rebind the civic fabric? And I'm more in that realm, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about how to rebind the civic fabric. And to me, a lot of it has to do on the most intimate level. Remember, I quoted Bill Milliken at the beginning, who said that lives aren't changed by programs, they're changed by relationships. Rebinding a civic fabric, whether here in the Valley or any other community around the country, involves a certain thing, a certain sort of relationship. And to me, what it involves is commitment. And in my view, I've been thinking about this, that each of us in the course of our lives usually makes 5 big commitments in life. To a spouse and a family, to a vocation, to our career, to our friends, to a philosophy or a faith, some worldview, and then to our community. And the success of our lives depends on how well we choose those 5 big commitments and how well we execute upon them and how faithful we are to them. These are the kind of commitments that in the Bible that Ruth made to Naomi. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And so it's our commitment to these long promises that really shape our lives. And to me, making a commitment is falling in love with something and then building a structure of behavior around it for those moments when love falters. You love the community of the Valley. You commit some time on a day like today to learning about this community, to caring about it, to contributing to it, and you want to do that over years. A commitment is not something of passing month. It's something over a lifetime, or at least over several decades. And our commitments form our identities. When we describe someone, we usually describe what they're committed to. They form our integrity. Our character is built by how well we keep our commitments. Our character is like this wagon wheel, and every time we keep one of our promises, we strengthen one of the spokes of the wheel. And every time we break a promise, we remove a spoke and we make the whole wheel weaker. Life is a journey from open options to sweet compulsions, to committing ourselves to various things, and you sort of find a higher freedom from that. And so to make a commitment, whether it's to a community or to a spouse or to a philosophy, you have to go through a few phases. And you refine the civic fabric by going through the phases. The first phase is the choosing of a commitment. What am I going to devote my life to? Who am I going to marry? What faith do I really believe in? Usually it starts just with a little glance of interest. I ran into a woman who has a guy who's a hairdresser in Houston. His name David. And David told the story the following story. There was a woman who was a pianist in Houston, and she was going to go to move here to San Francisco to be with her fiance and then spend the rest of life with him. And so she thought, oh, before I move, I'll get my hair done one more time. So she walks into this hair salon, and she sees the owner of the salon, David, cutting somebody else's hair. And she goes into the dressing room, and she calls her mom, and she says, I've just seen the man I'm going to marry. It's this hair cutter guy. So she gets her hair shampooed. She's sitting down in the chair. David is cutting her hair, and David's asking her, like, what's your life? What's your story? And she says, well, I'm a pianist, and I'm about to move to San Francisco to be with my fiance, but I won't do it if you'll marry me. And as David tells this story, she says this to me, I looked down at my scissors, and I never felt more free than I did at that instant. And he told her, it's a deal. And they've been married for 18 years. Now, most of us don't have a first glance that dramatic. But we do have a glimmer of something. Oh, I enjoy writing code. For me, I read a book called Paddington the Bear at age 7, and I decided at that moment I wanted to become a writer. Or you meet someone, and that begins the commitment. The second part of the commitment is seeing the truth or getting to know the person. If you've ever been on a date, you have these miracle coincidences when you think you're getting along. Like, oh, neither of us love foie gras. Amazing, an amazing coincidence. We should get married. I don't like paying $8 for a cupcake, neither do you. Amazing. And so that's beginning to learn about the other person. Love is not a process the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. It's a process of attention. And you just want to learn about that thing and participate, as you guys are, in the thing. And then there's a process of moral responsibility. Once you've made a promise to a person or an implied promise to a community, your excellence, your self-worth, your image of yourself depends on how well you follow through on that promise. And we don't have a word for this, but we all want to be seen and want to be good people. We have this moral motivation. We have all these words for economic self-interest and for sexual motivation, but the desire to be good is one of the strongest desires. And the way I think about it is there's this reclusive part of ourself that doesn't care about Facebook, it doesn't care about money, it doesn't care about status. It cares about goodness, being good. It cares about some connection to an unconditional love and to truth. And in our 20s, that part of us, I think of it as this reclusive leopard. It's up in the hills, we're busy working on our career, we're building a family. It's up in the forest somewhere. But then there are some moments in life where it comes down and you sort of glimpse it through the trees. There might be a moment of suffering when that internal part of yourself, that spiritual part of yourself is out. There might be a moment of joy like I had with my kids in the backyard. But there's some point in every life where the leopard comes out of the hills, it sits there on the floor, and it says, who have you served? What are you connected to? Why were you here? And the people who haven't thought about that question have to live with the knowledge that they don't really know the answers to that. But the people who've made commitments and who've built a civic fabric, those are the people who at least have an answer. And then once you make the fabric, then we support each other. And one of the nice things about communities like this is there's implicit standards of behavior in how we will act toward another to be mutually supportive of this thing we love together, in this case, a valley. I had a friend named Roger who had a sister named Ruthie, who was a teacher in northern Louisiana, a little tiny town. And she unfortunately died at age 40 of cancer. And 1,600 people came to her funeral, even though it was a tiny town, just because she generated inner light. And one of the things Ruthie would do was she would, on Christmas Eve, put a candle on every gravestone in the town cemetery, just because she wanted to remember the dead. She died just before Christmas Eve. And my friend Rod asked his mom on Christmas Eve, you know, should we do what Ruthie used to do and put the candles on each of the gravestones? And his mom said, you know, normally I would do it, but this year it's just too tough. I just can't get through it. And so they didn't do it, but they drove across town to another family house, and they happened to drive by the cemetery, and they saw that somebody else had gone to every gravestone and put a candle up there. And that to me is a symbol of how communities lift each other up, how the standards of behavior and standards of service are passed on one to another. And it's happened in this room, and it happens across America, but it doesn't happen in a lot of America. And so Trump, I think, will create problems for a lot of us. I'm not a fan, but the only way to address it is to rebuild that fabric relationship by relationship and build a country that is actually joined together where we actually see the same reality. Thank you.